everybody, and welcome to the Little Fella Sports Podcast. And as part of our IPL preview, we've got Karthikeya, obviously known as Static on Twitter, joining us today. We're here to discuss about the Sunrisers of Hyderabad, and this is actually going to be a long series of preview of each of the teams, and this is one of the first teams we're going to preview of. So first things first, guys, please do like, share, subscribe to the channel, and welcome to the show, Karthikeya. It's an absolute pleasure having you on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on here. You guys are doing some great work, so nice to be a part of it and contribute.
Thanks a lot, Karthikeya. Okay, so first things first, as an SRH fan, talking about last season first. Let's go a little behind. What were your expectations as such heading into last season, and what do you make of what's happened last season in general?
Yeah, I think if you look at this history for Sunrisers, we've made the semifinals every year since 2016. So coming into a season, you'd obviously expect them to replicate the same thing. And I think last year was a slow start because with the change in coach, I think the team was acclimatizing to the conditions. But I think the youngsters stood up at the end. Abdul Samad got into the game. Natarajan started bowling well. So I think as they found their feet, there was a lot more promise. And I think that'll carry on to the season as well.
Fair enough. And of course, there was still, as you mentioned, the start of the season was slightly slow in terms of performances as well as results as well. Obviously, towards the end, you guys did get into the playoffs towards the end, but it was pretty close shout, right? Because you had 3 or 4 teams competing towards the end, and of course, as you know, in the IPL, there is one spot always which is made by either a couple of points or just by net run rate or something very close. So, looking into that, how important was this option, the option which happened last month for Sunrisers Hyderabad, and do you believe that they've really closed the gap in terms of filling in the holes they needed to?
Yeah, of course. So in the IPL, even 14 games, people might see it as a longer tournament, but even 14 games can get volatile because of the nature of T20. And yeah, there's always going to be that element of luck. And obviously, Sunrisers got lucky playing an understrength Mumbai in their last game. But I think there was some progress towards the end of the season. They got on a winning streak. And like I said earlier, the youngsters started performing and the fringe players started getting into the game. So that's obviously something positive to take into next season. However, I think they made only three additions to the squads from last year. So that's definitely a point of concern because I think a couple of other teams, namely Rajasthan and Punjab Kings, have upgraded the squad from last year's. And like we said, when this cluster in the middle of the table, you want to separate yourself from the rest of the pack. So I don't think they've made any massive upgrades from last season, which is going to be a concern going in for sure.
What do you make of the signings? In terms of Kedar, Jadhav, Jagdish, and Sudhir. Do you believe they'll be first choice players? Because I personally don't.
No, because I think Suchit is a left arm spinner and there's already Shehbaz Nadeem and Abhishek Sharma as the part timers. So I don't see him getting into the team. Kedar Jadhav again with Samad and Abhishek performing towards the end of last season, and you would assume Riddhiman Saha and Vijay Shankar will be ahead on the priority queue as well. So I don't think he'll get a game, and I don't know what to make of Mujib honestly because they already had Rashid Khan and Mohammad Nabi as overseas spinning options. So I don't think any other team goes in and picks three overseas spinners. I personally don't think any IPL teams needs more than one. But I think it somehow works out at the end because they end up playing 5 games at Chepauk this season. So if the pitch is as slow as it usually is in previous seasons, that might come around and help them.
If there's one thing I'd say, personally lacking the Sunrisers bowling attack, obviously it's been very consistent in terms of performance and output in the last, say, 3 or 4 years. As you mentioned, 2016, you've been consistently in the semi-finals or the finals, and your batting lineup, you have to say, is not one of the strongest in the tournament. Of course, you've got a couple of really great batsmen, but slight holes, especially in the middle order. Lack of Indian spinners may be a little bit of a concern, and also lack of a foreign fast bowler, daredevil fast bowler. I know you've got Jason Holder, but you still have that piece which is probably missing that some teams like Rajasthan Royals or Delhi Capitals or Mumbai Indians have, right?
Yeah, definitely, because I think the formula for success for Mumbai Indians, and now copied somewhat by Rajasthan Royals, is picking two proper overseas seamers in the 11. And Sunrisers can't really afford that because they have Rashid Khan, and it's not a bad thing because he's one of the best bowlers in the world. So definitely, I think the other overseas slot you want to have a seamer, but again, like you said, given the lack of local batting options, you end up playing David Warner for sure, and you'd want one of Kane Williamson or Johnny Best in the 11 as well. So that locks out a lot of overseas options. And Jason Holder, as we know, is not express pick. I think he massively overperformed last year. He was definitely trying more Yorkers, which is the right mentality, but I don't think he's going to survive for a full 14 game season. So, yes, that second overseas fast bowling slot will be a concern. Local spin options, you said, I don't think that's a huge concern because when you have Rashid Khan, your middle over spin is already covered, right? So, I don't think that's going to be a huge concern.
Agree with you. Of course, but as you mentioned, Jason Holder's performance was really good. I mean, I personally did not expect him to come out and perform that well because obviously it's not easy coming into mid-season and not being part of the scheme from the first. So you have to remember that these guys haven't been playing too much cricket before the last IPL. So in terms of that, he's definitely exceeded expectations. So now we look into the squad and probably try to make out what kind of playing 11 it potentially could be. So going to the squads, I'll just bring it up. All right, so this is the squad. So, what do you make of? I mean, obviously, some holes are pretty covered in terms of you've got top order batting, which is pretty settled, and you've got obviously the world's best spinner, arguably, in the lineup. So, how do you expect Sunrisers to go about? Because one of the major questions I have is who bats at say 3 and 4, because you've got the likes of Manish Pandey, Williamson, and even Johnny Best as an option. So, in terms of a top 4, what would you expect to see? What would you like to see?
For me, Manish Pandey is locked in at 3. If you bat him any lower down, I think his value diminishes because he's somewhat of an anchor too, and I don't see his gears against spin in the middle overs improving in the last few years. So Manish Pandey definitely starts 3, and we have Warner opening. So I think the one dilemma for them would be who takes the second opening slot. I think they'll carry on with Ridhiman Saha from last year because he did well. There's no point changing it for the start of the season. But I think coming back to Indian conditions, I don't know if he can sustain his approach over 14 games again. So they might need to switch it up and bring in Johnny Bairstow later in the season. For me, Kane Williamson is more of your pace range hitter down the order. So he'd slot in at 4 or 5. Again, there's a slight concern against him against wrist spinners, but I think his range against pace last year, as if you would have seen him play against Jafra Archer, Kankisar Rabada, Andrit Nokia, he showed excellent range. So I think he'll slot in nicely at 4 or 5. And I think it's about working your way around that. Abdul Samad's spin hitting potential last year, I don't think they maximized it. So I think they could float him up at some stages of the game. If they play Jason Holder, he has very good range against spin because of his long levers. So I think they could promote him up if they need to, and Abhishek Sharma is a left-handed option. So there's definitely range for floating things around a little bit, but I think the main dilemma is whether they start with Bairstow and leave out Holder. No, I think Williamson definitely starts because they're playing at Chepauk, and
makes sense.
He was the best batsman last season by far, I think. So I think the dilemma is now between Holder and Bairstow, who they start with. Personally, I think Bairstow is more sustainable throughout an entire season, but given the lack of second bowling option, they might start with Holder.
Yeah, I think especially the fact that he got the long levers, as you mentioned, towards the end. I think rather than backing, say, Kedar Jadhav, who could potentially come in at 6 or 7 if Jason Holder does not play, then you could see someone like Holder definitely slotting in at 6. One person you obviously mentioned was Abdul Samad. Obviously, lots of expectations, even heading into last season. I mean, there was a lot of talk about him, and he definitely, I'd say, exceeded expectations in some way because even though he had the name and some sort of expectation, not many of us have watched him play, but he still did really well, especially his numbers against express pace. I know it's a small sample size, but he's got a strike rate of 238 against extreme pace, which is actually ridiculous for a 21-year-old. So how excited are you for him personally this season, and how much are you expecting from him?
Yeah, definitely. I think we got knocked out in the last game against Delhi, but watching him perform was obviously a great sign going into the future because before the season, we knew his range against spin. We saw some videos floating around YouTube, around social media, and we knew how good he was against spin. But that level of comfort that he showed against Nokia, Rabada, even Bumrah.
A couple of hits over mid-wicket, I remember that.
Yeah, I don't think any other batsman has that range at this age. So obviously that's and the power hitting range that he's shown. I think he can be very versatile up and down the order. So yeah, big expectations from him. I don't think he should be expected to carry the low order per se, but I think this could be the season he really breaks out because I don't think they uncovered his potential last year. There was one game they floated him up against Kings 11 and he didn't really do well, and then they started him back down the order. So I think this year there's a lot of floating potential and raw potential down the order as well.
And interesting, he actually didn't start the season also. He
Yes.
came in slightly late, but I assume that they just wanted to hold him back slightly a little bit. But I mean, some of the shots he played of the likes of Rabad and Nokia, I think the fact that he must have not faced pace of that level also. I mean, neither in the Sunrisers nets either. He wouldn't have faced pace even in the Sunrisers nets. So fair play to him because
Yeah.
he's got some experience in the domestic level, but I'm pretty sure he's never come up with guys bowling. Nokia was bowling 150, 155 last season, so fair play to him. So obviously he's got the top 6.
Yeah, there's definitely a problem with IPL teams. I don't think they go ahead and pick the boundary hitting option. They went ahead with picking the safe options in Priyam Garg, and I think they even played Riddhiman Saha over him early in the season. So yeah, that's definitely I think something IPL teams should work on. An easy way to figure that out is looking at their fours against sixes ratio, and Samad's was much higher than the other alternatives that they picked. So at least they saw the potential last year. So it's something to build on for sure.
Definitely. And of course, with the top 7 kind of settled, obviously we've got a couple of questions over whether Besto makes it or Jason only makes it. But obviously we've got Rashid Khan in it, no question. So 9, 10, 11, you'd say Bhuvneshwar and Natarajan are pretty much nailed picks. Of course, you're hoping that Bhuvneshwar doesn't break down. So what else? I mean, apart from Bhuvneshwar and Natarajan, any other Indian options you're looking at probably to fit in at 11 as a second spinner or even as an extra fast bowler?
Right. Sandeep was probably their best seamer last year because he was quite versatile in different stages of the innings. But if they start Sandeep, then you're locked out with Bhuvneshwar and Sandeep with the new ball, and then what happens to Holder? I don't trust Holder at the death, so that's going to be a bit of a dilemma. And that's why I said I don't think Holder's performance is going to be sustainable throughout the season because, okay, let's say they start with Khalil ahead of Sandeep. He's going to get smashed regardless, and they'll end up bringing Sandeep back. And that'll obviously create problems in different phases of the innings. And yeah, that's definitely an issue going forward. And they could start with Shahbaz Nadeem ahead of him, but
he's again, not done well in the IPL recently.
Yeah, he's been okay, but then if you look at it, Rashid Khan is a better matchup against right-handers, and Shahbaz Nadeem is also a better matchup against right. They could start with Nabi in Chepak ahead of both Besto and Holder, but I don't know, his batting against Rispin, I was looking at it the other day, and that's definitely gone really low. I think his average against Rispin is now 13 or something, and that includes all the thrashings he's given Rashid Khan. So, yeah, there's definitely a bit of
one interesting thing is they didn't give him games. I mean, I thought he'd play slightly more than he did, especially towards at the start of the season. I mean, towards the end, obviously, got the combination slightly closer, but I think the start, I was slightly surprised that he didn't get games at all. I know he played only a couple games.
Right. Yeah, he was coming off a very good CPL, so I expected him to start straight up. But I think Holder did well later, so they didn't see the need for that going forward. And I don't know what Mitchell Marsh's role is in the team because once you have Holder as a pace bowling all rounder, picking another one is just redundant. So in place of him, I would have gone for a proper express spacer, and that would have been of use later in the season because I think they end up playing at Chinnaswamy and Eden Gardens later in the season, where you definitely want a proper seam bowler.
And also, importantly, I mean, as you mentioned, Rashid's a lock, Williamson's a lock, Warner's a lock, and then even the other two spots, Best and Holder, have been pretty good contributors for Sunrisers. Right. So you don't really have a role for Mitchell Marsh. That's where you felt that they could have probably released him and given at least themselves an option to go and get a fast bowler, and that makes it even more baffling that they went and got Mujib now.
Yes. Yeah, and I think in 2018, when they played Billy Stanlake, when he was actually a good hard length bowler, they used him against particular matchups. They played him against Kolkata Knight Riders, they played him against Mumbai Indians, and they targeted Andre Russell, Kieron Pollard. that's something they're going to miss this year without that additional X factor option that they can bring into the team. And
And the
I
Indian
think
players
that,
are on.
yeah, and they went and tried to get Adam Milne in the auction, went out of budget because Mumbai were obviously targeting him. Then they tried to get Tom Curran, which fits the nature of the team. And you would have thought they would go ahead and pick up some other express seamer. There was Joseph, there was Chamar Holder, there was some exciting Nathan Ellis, there was some exciting fast bowling options, and then they went ahead and picked Mujib. So that was kind of disappointing, yeah.
I mean, you could argue that as far as ideally, obviously, you want a starter fast bowler, a guy who will start definitely, but even someone just to have him in the bag, someone who doesn't play 14 games but could come and do a role for 3 or 4 games. That's probably where they probably missed the trick, you
Right.
could say, in terms of their weakness. Because, as you mentioned, I mean, that's one spot that Sunrisers don't have an option for an
Of
express
course.
fast bowler, either in the Indian ranks or the foreign ranks. So
Mm-hmm.
coming out to the X factor player, I mean, obviously it's I mean, as usual with Sunrisers, you expect a lot, right? Because they've consistently made to the playoffs. So in terms of trying to push to the next step, I know that we've mentioned there are weaknesses, but if there's one player who could potentially bridge those weaknesses and take Sunrisers to a final or even the title, who could it be?
Like we discussed earlier, it's hard to look past Samad because he gives you everything at this point in that lower middle order, and it's been a weakness for Sunrisers for so many years now. So there's something he definitely bridges. He covers a lot of bases there. But apart from that, I think what is very important is Natarajan replicates what he did last season. As we saw in 2018, Siddharth Kaul had an amazing season,
That's
and
good.
after that, nothing happened. I think Khalil had a good season in
2019,
2019, right, and
he picked
2020.
wickets.
Yeah, he did go, but he did pick up early wickets, and again, he faded away the season after that. So for Natarajan, it's about teams figuring out the patterns that he
Preference.
employs in the depth because, as we saw against Rajasthan last year, they figured him out. They went out there, they started playing scoops, and he didn't know how to counter that. We saw Tewatia, Rian Parag, and Archer, all three of them. It was definitely a team plan because they saw the patterns that he was employing at the depth. And then he went back to the slower options and he still got smashed. So, what's important for Natarajan is he starts working up that pace, starts using some hard lengths at the depth, and evolves as the season goes because once your sample size increases at the depth, teams are going to start picking up what you're trying to do. So it's important for Natarajan to replicate that this season.
And especially for a bowler like Natarajan, who you could say is a specialist in terms of Yorker, that's when if he going into the next season, if he develops
Right.
few more variations, his Yorker obviously becomes a lot more effective, and he's got something to fall back on in case the Yorker doesn't work.
Of course, yeah. And Bhuvneshwar's death bowling numbers in the last few years have been slightly declining as well, and you'd want him to give those two overs a swing at the top. So there's that one seam bowling option at the end that Natarajan has to fill in without fail, and how he goes will definitely define whether Sunrisers can cover for that lack of extra express seamer because when you have someone with the limitations Natarajan has, you want him to always overperform.
Finally, heading over to the predictions, of course, as you mentioned, 4 playoffs in a row or five playoffs in a row.
Five
I think
playoffs in
since
a row. Right.
2016. So 5 playoffs in a row. Can SRH go to the next step, or do you think they fall back in fact?
Right. Honestly, when right after the auction happened, my thoughts were, okay, we ended up in a mid-table muddle last year, and a couple of other teams have definitely upgraded themselves. So naturally, you would think they'd fall behind, but I think the schedule is very favorable. Playing in Chepauk at the start gives Rashid Khan that puts Rashid Khan right into the game. And if he can give you his usual 2 for 20 spell, that takes 4 overs out of the equation. And all the batting has to do is just get to par, honestly, and you'd expect Rashid to do the rest after that. And I think they have another leg at Delhi after that, which also
It's very
features
friendly.
slower pitches, right? And if they can pair together Rashid and maybe Nadeem or some other Indian spinner, or switch to Nabi if it comes down to that, I think the schedule is really favorable for them. So, given how they've shown that they can overcome their limitations in the last few years, I would expect a playoff finish again.
Fair enough. So obviously, as 5 years of history and consistency has shown, you would expect SRH to be in and around. I'm not quite sure whether they make the playoffs this time. Maybe they could even push again. But obviously, it's something very exciting to watch for. So thanks a lot,
And I think,
Karthikeya, for
go ahead.
No, you can.
Yeah, I think Trevor Bayliss as well. Last year, he was getting used to the team, and he probably didn't understand the dynamics of the team yet. But now, given that he has had one full season, I think this is the time to actually judge him on actual results rather than process. Because once you get used to the strengths of the team and the roles that each player has to fill in, you'd start expecting performances to come as well.
And Tom Moody is back as well.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, we at the end of this episode. Thanks a lot, Karthikeya, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. So guys, please do like, share, subscribe to the channel, and thanks a lot, Karthikeya. We'll catch you again soon.
Thank you.